Right now, as you are watching this, the same stretch of the Gulf Coast that spent last week broiling under triple-digit heat is being rained on by a tropical storm, while 600 miles to the west, the exact same ridge of high pressure that just got pushed out of the southeast is rebuilding itself over the Rockies and the plains and turning heat risk maps deep red all over again. This is not two separate weather stories. It is one weather pattern breaking apart in the east and reassembling in the west, and the National Weather Service's own forecast discussion, published in the middle of the night, called it exactly that, an amplified and blocky pattern with a warming ridge sandwiched between troughs on both coasts. This is the story of how the heat wave baking the Gulf Coast is actually ending, why the thing replacing it is a tropical storm nobody expected this early in a season forecasters had already called below normal, and why that same heat is not disappearing so much as relocating somewhere maps are about to turn just as red. No hype, no filler, just what today's forecasts actually say. Drop a comment and tell me whether you are getting rain or still stuck in the heat right now. I read every one of these. If you want weather coverage that tracks the actual pattern instead of just repeating a single day's headline, subscribe. It costs nothing, and a like helps this reach people trying to plan around what is coming this week. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. The storm now doing the work of ending the Gulf Coast heat wave started, almost apologetically, as a disorganized cluster of showers that drifted off the west coast of Florida late last week. Before it even had a name, it dumped 4 to 8 inches of rain. Around Tampa Bay, enough to cause localized flooding on its own. That cluster then moved out over the unusually warm waters of the eastern Gulf. And by Sunday, the National Hurricane Center had designated it Tropical Depression 2. A Hurricane Hunter aircraft flying into the system. Monday evening measured sustained winds of 40 miles per hour, just enough to cross the threshold into tropical storm strength, and the system was upgraded and named Bertha, the second named storm of the 2026 Atlantic hurricane season, notable mainly because this season was supposed to be a quiet one. AccuWeather's own hurricane forecasters had projected somewhere between 8 and 14 named storms for the entire season, below the historical average, largely because of the same developing El Niño pattern that has been steering weather across multiple continents this year. A quiet seasonal forecast, though, has never meant nothing happens in July, and Bertha is proof of that. What makes Bertha a genuinely strange storm to track is that it is lopsided almost to the point of looking broken on satellite imagery. Strong upper-level wind shear coming out of the north, combined with dry air pulled in off the mainland, has torn apart any organized structure on Bertha's northern side, leaving the storm's heaviest rain, its strongest wind, and essentially all of its punch concentrated well to the south of its own center, much of it sitting offshore over open water. That lopsided structure is actually good news for the coast. The National Hurricane Center said explicitly that the worst of Bertha's rainfall, in some spots exceeding a foot, would stay out over the Gulf rather than coming on shore, which is the main reason. Forecasters do not expect widespread flooding despite a named tropical system parked directly off the coast. That does not mean the coast gets off free. As of Wednesday morning, Bertha's maximum sustained winds sat at 50 miles per hour, down 10 from the evening before as the storm continues, a slow weakening trend, but tropical storm warnings still stretch from the western Florida panhandle across southern Alabama and Mississippi into southeastern Louisiana, covering metropolitan New Orleans and Lake Pontchartrain directly. Rainfall totals of 1 to 4 inches, with isolated amounts up to 6 to 8 inches in the strongest thunderstorm cells, are expected from the panhandle through Louisiana and possibly into the Texas coast, enough to trigger the kind of fast, localized flash flooding that catches urban areas like New Orleans off guard even when a storm is technically weak. Storm surges forecast to reach 2 to 4 feet above normal tide levels along the northern Gulf Coast, with the higher end of that range possible along the Alabama and Mississippi shoreline and the Louisiana coast north of the Mississippi River's mouth, and forecasters have flagged a real risk of life-threatening rip currents up and down the coast regardless of exactly where Bertha's center ends up. The mechanism behind that lopsided shape is worth understanding on its own, because it explains why some tropical storms turn into major flooding disasters and others, like Bertha, mostly just pass through. Wind shear is the change in wind speed and direction at different altitudes above a storm, and when that shear is strong, it tilts a storm's structure and rips its thunderstorms away from directly over the center, the same basic force, just working in the opposite direction, that let a storm like last month's Pacific super typhoon explode in strength when shear was nearly absent. Bertha is getting hit with strong shear from the north, combined with dry continental air being pulled in behind it, and the combination is enough to keep the storm from ever fully wrapping itself around its own center, which is exactly why forecasters keep describing it as lopsided rather than simply weak. Bertha is not the only storm on the board right now either. In the eastern Pacific, Hurricane Fausto is active well offshore, A reminder that this stretch of the calendar, still weeks ahead of the traditional mid-August to October peak of the Atlantic season, is nonetheless capable of producing genuine tropical systems on both sides of North America at once, even in a year forecasters expect to run below the historical average overall. The National Weather Service's Weather Prediction Center has been blunt about how this event actually ranks on their own hazard scale, placing the flash flood risk from Bertha at level 1 out of 4 along the northern Gulf, the lowest active category rather than the moderate or high-risk labels reserved for genuinely dangerous flooding setups. In plain terms, Bertha is a real disruptive storm capable of coastal flooding, isolated flash flooding, and dangerous surf. But it is not shaping up to be a catastrophic flood event the way a slow-moving, well-organized system can be. The storm is forecast to keep crawling westward along the Gulf Coast through the rest of the week, weakening back to a tropical depression by Thursday and likely dissipating or transitioning into a post-tropical system by the time it approaches the Texas coast this weekend. Here is the part that turns this from a single storm story into a pattern story, and it is the part your forecast maps are already showing if you know where to look. Bertha's cloud cover, rain, and cooler, more humid air are doing exactly what a tropical system does to a heat dome sitting in its path. They are physically displacing it. The same upper-level ridge of high pressure that spent the last stretch of July parked over the eastern half of the country, the one responsible for the record heat that broke daily highs across the east, earlier this month is being shoved out of the southeast by the trough associated with Bertha and a second trough digging in off the west coast. But a ridge of high pressure rarely just vanishes when it gets pushed. It relocates, and this one is relocating directly into the south-central United States, the Southwest, the Intermountain West, and the Rockies. The Weather Prediction Center's own forecast discussion this week describes that relocated ridge as offering, in their words, at least major heat risk conditions, with temperatures running 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit above an already hot seasonal average, humidity stacking on top of that, and heat index values climbing to 105 to 110 degrees Fahrenheit or higher in some locations. Denver is forecast to run in the low to mid-90s for much of the coming week, potentially reaching the upper 90s to near 100 degrees Fahrenheit by next weekend. Salt Lake City faces a similar range, mid-90s climbing toward 100 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not a new, separate heat wave arriving out of nowhere. It is the same energy that just finished cooking the east, sliding west and settling in over a region that is simultaneously heading into its own North American monsoon season, a seasonal pattern that typically brings thunderstorms, flash flooding, and dust storms to the southwest as summer moisture increases, but only after this dry, record-breaking heat squeezes through first. So when you hear that the heat is ending, the honest, complete version of that sentence is that the heat is ending in one specific place while beginning in another, and the maps tracking both halves of that story are doing very different things right now. Along the Gulf Coast, the maps turning red this week are tropical storm warning maps, storm surge maps, and rip current risk maps, all driven by Bertha. Out across the south-central states, the Southwest, and the Rockies, the maps turning red are heat risk maps, the same color-coded tool the National Weather Service uses everywhere in the country to flag when heat crosses from merely uncomfortable into genuinely dangerous for anyone without reliable air conditioning or the ability to limit outdoor exposure, and this week that tool is showing major, and in some spots the maximum extreme, category settling in across an enormous swath of the country's midsection. There is a broader lesson buried inside this, and it applies well beyond this 1 week, especially for anyone who assumes a quiet seasonal forecast means a quiet month. A single seasonal hurricane forecast calling for a below normal Atlantic season, like the 8 to 14 named storms AccuWeather projected for 2026, describes an average across an entire 6-month season. Not a guarantee about what happens in. So what does this actually mean for you, depending on where you are watching from? If you are anywhere along the northern Gulf Coast, from the Florida Panhandle to Louisiana, the practical advice this week is straightforward. Stay out of the water given the rip current risk, expect scattered power outages from gusty winds and thunderstorms, and take the 2 to 4 foot storm surge forecast seriously along low-lying coastal roads, even though Bertha itself is a weak, disorganized system. If you are anywhere in the south-central states, the Southwest, or the Rockies, the practical advice is almost the opposite of relief. The heat that just left the east is arriving on your doorstep instead, and it is worth checking your local heat risk forecast the same way people along the coast are checking hurricane cones, because the underlying danger, dehydration, and heat illness building over consecutive hot days works exactly the same way, whether the ridge sits over Ohio or over Colorado. And if you happen to live somewhere the maps currently show neither warning, treat that as a lull rather than a guarantee, since this same ridge has already proven this month that it does not disappear so much as pack up and move to wherever the upper-level pattern pulls it next. And the Southwest's own monsoon season, arriving right behind this heat, tends to swing conditions from dry and dangerous heat straight into localized flash flooding and dust storms within the same week. To bring this together, the heat wave that gripped the eastern half of the country is genuinely ending, but only because a lopsided, historically early tropical storm named Bertha is currently shoving it out of the way along the Gulf Coast, bringing 1 to 4 inches of rain. Isolated totals near 8 inches, 50-mile-per-hour winds, and 2 to 4 feet of storm surge to a stretch of coastline from the Florida Panhandle to Louisiana. At the very same time, the high-pressure ridge responsible for that heat has simply relocated, rebuilding over the south-central United States, the Southwest, and the Rockies, where forecast maps are now showing major to extreme heat risk conditions, with heat index values pushing past 105 degrees Fahrenheit, arriving just ahead of the region's own monsoon season. Neither half of this story is really over. One system is winding down while the other is only getting started, and the maps for both are red for genuinely different reasons. We will keep tracking both halves of this as the week develops, straight from the National Hurricane Center, the Weather Prediction Center, and NOAA's own regional offices. Not a single day's headline treated like the whole story. Subscribe if you want the update the moment either system actually changes, because between a lopsided tropical storm and a relocating heat dome, at least one of these maps is going to look different by the weekend. And leave that comment below. Tell me which side of this pattern you are actually living through right now. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.